On the morning of December 7, 1941, Isoroku Yamamoto sat aboard the battleship Nagato, at anchor in Hashirajima anchorage, and waited for the radio signal that would tell him whether his carriers had succeeded. The air in the operations room smelled of machine oil and cigarette smoke. When the signal came, Tora, 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 the officers around him broke into celebration, gripping each other's shoulders, exhaling the particular relief of men who had spent months planning something catastrophic. Yamamoto did not celebrate. He sat with his hands folded on the chart table and said nothing for a long time. What he knew in that moment, and what almost no one in the room beside him understood, was that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of a Japanese victory. It was the beginning of a Japanese defeat. He had done the arithmetic years before. He had seen the factories, driven past the oil fields, stood at the edge of the steel mills, and he had counted. The numbers did not lie, and they did not bend to national pride or imperial ambition. The United States could replace every ship burning in Pearl Harbor within 18 months. Japan could not replace its losses at the same rate in 18 years. He had told Tokyo this. He had written it in memoranda and said it in meetings, and repeated it in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. He had told the Navy Minister in 1941 that if forced into a war with America, he could promise 6 months, perhaps a year, of vigorous action and decisive results. After that, he could promise nothing. He had no confidence in ultimate victory. The men who read those assessments had gone ahead and ordered the attack anyway. So the question that follows Yamamoto through every account of the Pacific War, the question that has never been answered cleanly, is this: how does a man who knew exactly what was coming, who had seen the sleeping giant with his own eyes and measured its dimensions, end up commanding the operation that woke it? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering to any single party. It runs through a young officer walking the streets of Cambridge in 1919, through poker tables and oil derricks, and the particular way industrial scale looks when you have grown up in a country that does not yet have it. Part 1. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Part 1. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on April 4, 1884 in Nagaoka, a city in Niigata Prefecture on the western coast of Japan's main island. He was the 6th son of a schoolmaster named Sadakichi Takano. The name Isoroku is an old Japanese number, 56, because that was his father's age when he was born. The family was not wealthy. The city of Nagaoka had a specific reputation in Japanese culture. It was a city that had backed the losing side in the Boshin War of 1868, the civil war that restored imperial rule, and its people had spent the following decades rebuilding from near total destruction with a particular kind of stubborn, methodical pride. Yamamoto absorbed that culture. He was adopted at age 16 by the Yamamoto family, which is where he got the name history knows him by. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1897. He was commissioned as a midshipman in 1904, in time to serve at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the decisive engagement where Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single afternoon. Yamamoto was a junior officer on the cruiser Nishin. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand to an enemy shell. He kept the scars for the rest of his life. He watched Togo win a battle so complete that it became the foundational myth of Japanese naval doctrine for the next 40 years. Find the enemy fleet, engage it in a decisive battle, destroy it utterly. The doctrine had a name, Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, and it shaped everything the Imperial Japanese Navy built and planned from Tsushima onward. Yamamoto rose steadily through the officer corps. He was a gifted poker player, genuinely gifted, the kind who could calculate pot odds in his head while conducting a conversation, and he applied the same probabilistic thinking to naval strategy. He was also, by all accounts, a man who actually read the intelligence assessments his subordinates handed him, rather than setting them aside. In 1919, he was sent to Harvard University as a language student. He spent 2 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, studying English, studying American culture, and doing something that very few Japanese naval officers of his generation bothered to do. He traveled. He drove through the American South. He visited Texas. He saw the oil fields. He saw the steel mills of Pennsylvania. He understood, in a way that is very difficult to convey without sounding like a cliché, that the United States was not simply a large country, it was a different kind of country. A country whose productive capacity was not a political abstraction, but a physical, visible, measurable reality that you could see from the road. Stop and think about what he was looking at. In 1920, the United States produced 66% of the world's oil, not of the Western world's oil, of the world's oil. American steel production in that year was 42 million tons. Japan's was less than 1 million. American coal production was 597 million tons. Japan's was 31 million. The American economy in 1920 was roughly 12 times the size of Japan's by industrial output. These are not competitive numbers. These are not numbers that suggest a close race. These are numbers that describe two different categories of nation. Yamamoto returned to Japan. He was sent back to the United States again from 1925 to 1928 as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. This time he was older, more senior, and his access was broader. He watched American aviation develop. He watched the debates in Congress over naval appropriations. He read the American press. He played poker in Washington social circles with American officials who spoke freely because they assumed a Japanese naval officer couldn't possibly understand the implications of what they were saying. He understood every implication. By the time he returned to Japan for good, Yamamoto had a conviction that would define the rest of his career. Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Not because of courage, or skill, or doctrine, or tactics, because of arithmetic. Because the ratio of industrial capacity was so lopsided that no conceivable military advantage could compensate for it over time. This was not a popular view in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was not a popular view in the army. It was not a popular view in the government. Japan had beaten Russia in 1905. Japan had been on the winning side in the First World War. Japan had been expanding in China since 1931. The culture of the officer corps, particularly the army, had developed a belief in the primacy of spirit over material. That Japanese fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi, would overcome Western material advantages through superior will. Yamamoto thought this was a dangerous fantasy. He said so, repeatedly, in terms that were unusually direct for a culture that valued indirect communication. In 1940, as the war faction in Tokyo pushed harder for a military alliance with Germany and confrontation with the United States, Yamamoto wrote to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa with a clarity that was almost reckless given the political climate. He wrote that if war with America came, he could run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year. But he had absolutely no confidence in what would happen if the war went on for 2 or 3 years. Read that sentence again. This was the man who planned Pearl Harbor. He was not planning it because he thought it would win the war. He was planning it because he thought it was the only possible move in a situation he considered strategically hopeless from the outset. The attack was not a strategy for victory. It was, in Yamamoto's own thinking, a desperate gamble designed to buy Japan enough time to negotiate a settlement from a position of temporary strength before America's industrial capacity came fully online. The gamble required one thing above all else to work: that the shock of Pearl Harbor would cause the American government to seek a compromise peace rather than commit to a war of annihilation. Yamamoto had lived in America. He knew Americans. He believed this was unlikely. He planned the attack anyway. Part 2. What the factories meant. To understand why Yamamoto's industrial arithmetic was correct, and why Tokyo chose not to believe it, you need to understand what American industrial capacity actually looked like in 1941, and what it became between 1942 and 1945. In 1940, the United States produced 131 naval vessels of all types. That same year, Japan produced 30. The ratio was not quite 4-1 yet. But the American capacity was not fixed, it was expandable. The Japanese capacity was already near its ceiling. Here is the critical number that Yamamoto understood and his superiors did not want to hear. The United States had not yet begun to build for war. In 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year. Congressional observers laughed. Industry observers said it was impossible. The actual production figure for American military aircraft in 1940 was 6,028 planes. That was the starting point. Meet Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. 39 years old, born in Nara Prefecture, a career naval aviator who had been flying since 1928, he led the first wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, 183 aircraft, and he was in the air above the harbor when the first bombs fell. He would later write a memoir called Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, co-authored with Masatake Okumiya, in which he recorded his impressions of the attack and its aftermath with unusual candor. What he remembered most vividly, he wrote, was not the burning battleships, it was the absence of the American aircraft carriers from the harbor. The carriers were at sea. The USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was en route to Midway. The USS Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing repairs. 3 fleet carriers, untouched. Yamamoto knew this before the results came in. His intelligence staff had tracked the carriers' movements. He had built the attack plan around the assumption that the carriers might not be present, and he had accepted this risk because the battleships were the primary target of his doctrine. Kantai-Kassen demanded the destruction of the enemy's capital ships. But he also knew, in the way that a professional poker player knows when the pot odds have shifted against him, that the absence of the carriers changed the calculation in ways that his superiors were not processing. Now, the factories. In 1942, the year after Pearl Harbor, American shipyards produced 672 naval vessels. Not warships specifically, vessels of all military classifications, but the number includes 8 fleet carriers, 24 escort carriers, and 23 cruisers. Japan produced 68 naval vessels in the same year. Hold that difference. 672 versus 68. The ratio had moved from roughly 4-1 to roughly 10-1 in a single year. And this was before the American industrial machine had fully converted, before the automobile plants had completely retooled, before the full weight of the War Production Board's planning had translated into steel and aluminium and rivets. The aircraft numbers are even more stark. In 1942, American factories produced 47,836 military aircraft. Japan produced 8,861. The ratio was 5.4-1. In 1943, America produced 85,898 aircraft. Japan produced 16,693. The ratio was 5.1-1. In 1944, America produced 96,318 aircraft. Japan produced 28,180. The ratio was 3.4-1. Japan's production had nearly doubled, but American production had grown faster in absolute terms and was now so large that even Japan's improvement barely registered. These are not strategic assessments. These are factory outputs. These are men working 3 shifts. These are women, 2 million of them by 1944, working the assembly lines. These are the numbers that Yamamoto had tried to explain to Tokyo in 1940, and that Tokyo had declined to engage with seriously, because engaging with them seriously would have required acknowledging that the war they were planning to fight was a war they were planning to lose. The pilot quality gap compounds the production gap in a way that is almost too cruel to describe. In 1942, Japan's naval aviators were among the finest in the world. The men who flew at Pearl Harbor had an average of 800 hours of flight training. The men who flew at Midway in June of 1942 were veterans of China operations, veterans of Pearl Harbor, men who had been flying combat for years. But Japan's pilot training pipeline was calibrated for a peacetime navy. It could not scale. The training program that produced 800-hour veterans required roughly 2 years per pilot. Japan could not compress that timeline without sacrificing quality, and when they tried to compress it, they lost the quality without gaining the quantity. By 1944, new Japanese naval aviators were arriving at frontline units with fewer than 500 hours of total flight time, sometimes fewer than 300. They were flying against American pilots who had gone through an expanded training program. The Naval Aviation Cadet Program had grown from 7,000 graduates in 1942 to over 20,000 in 1943, and whose aircraft were now technically superior in almost every category. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had seemed invincible in 1941 and 1942, had a design ceiling. It was a masterpiece of lightness and range, achieved through the deliberate sacrifice of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It could outmaneuver almost anything it met in 1941 because it was designed for a specific tactical problem and solved that problem brilliantly. But it could not be substantially improved without being redesigned from the ground up, and Japan's aviation industry did not have the engineering depth to redesign it quickly while simultaneously producing replacements at scale. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which entered fleet service in January of 1943, was designed specifically to defeat the Zero. American intelligence had recovered a nearly intact Zero from the Aleutian Islands in July of 1942. It had been forced down by engine failure, and its pilot had died in the crash landing, and American engineers had spent months flying it, analyzing it, mapping every strength and every weakness. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero at all altitudes above 10,000 feet. It was more heavily armored, it had self-sealing fuel tanks, and it could be produced at a rate the Zero's manufacturers could not approach. This is what Yamamoto had tried to explain. Not in abstract strategic terms, but in the specific, concrete, mechanical terms that he had learned by traveling through Pennsylvania and Texas and watching what American industry actually was. Part 3. The geometry of the impossible. The Japanese war plan, as it evolved through 1941, was not as simple as attack Pearl Harbor and hope for the best. It had an internal logic, and that logic was not entirely irrational. The plan assumed that Japan would establish a defensive perimeter, a great arc running from Burma, through Malaya, through the Dutch East Indies, through New Guinea, through the Central Pacific island chains, up through Wake Island and the Marianas. A perimeter so vast and so costly to attack that the United States would eventually calculate that the cost of breaching it exceeded the value of doing so. Japan would extract the oil and rubber and raw materials it needed from the captured territories within the perimeter. The home islands would be secure, and eventually, exhausted and unwilling to pay the human cost of a trans-Pacific offensive, America would negotiate. This plan had a name, the Southern Resource Area Strategy, and it had one fatal assumption baked into its foundation. It assumed that the United States would make a rational cost-benefit calculation. Yamamoto did not believe this assumption was safe. He had read American newspapers. He had watched American politics. He understood, in the way that someone who has actually lived somewhere understands it, rather than the way that someone who has read intelligence reports about it understands it, that the United States was a country that, once genuinely angry, tended to stay angry. He had watched the reaction to the sinking of the USS Panay in December of 1937, when a Japanese aircraft bombed an American gunboat on the Yangtze River in China. The Japanese government had apologized. The American government had accepted the apology. But Yamamoto had noted the level of public fury in the American press, the speed with which Congress moved to authorize naval construction, the shift in public opinion polling. He understood that Pearl Harbor would not produce a cost-benefit calculation. It would produce a rage, and a raging America with 12 times Japan's industrial base was not a strategic problem. It was a strategic death sentence. Now here is the detail that almost every popular account of this story gets wrong. Yamamoto warned Tokyo that America was too big to fight, and he tried to design an alternative. The Pearl Harbor attack was, in his conception, the opening move of a strategy that required Japan to achieve a decisive military victory so overwhelming, so psychologically devastating, that it would force a political settlement before American industry could mobilize. The attack on Pearl Harbor was supposed to be followed by a second attack on Midway Atoll, 1,250 miles northwest of Honolulu, that would lure the American carriers into a battle where Japan's superior naval aviation could destroy them. With the Pacific Fleet's carrier force gone, with no mobile striking force left in the Pacific, the political pressure on Washington to negotiate would, in Yamamoto's estimate, become irresistible. This was the plan. It required the destruction of the American carrier force at Midway. It required this destruction before American shipyards could produce replacement carriers. It required this destruction in the first 6 months of the war. The Battle of Midway was fought between the 4th and 7th of June 1942, exactly 6 months and 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, along with 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. In a single engagement, Japan lost an irreplaceable portion of its carrier striking force. Irreplaceable because the pilot training pipeline could not produce replacements fast enough. Irreplaceable because the shipbuilding capacity could not produce new fleet carriers fast enough. Irreplaceable because the industrial margin simply did not exist. After Midway, Yamamoto knew with certainty what he had suspected from the beginning. There was no path to the decisive victory that his strategy required. There was only the long war that his arithmetic had always said Japan would lose. Meet Petty Officer First Class Kazuo Tsunoda, 24 years old, from Chiba Prefecture, a Zero pilot who had flown at Pearl Harbor and survived Midway. He was one of the experienced aviators who made it through the carrier losses intact. His carrier, the Zuikaku, had not been committed to the Midway operation due to aircrew losses from the Battle of the Coral Sea. He would go on to fly combat in the Solomons campaign through 1942 and into 1943. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he described watching the replacement pilots arrive at frontline units with a mixture of pity and dread. They were brave, he said. They were willing to die, but they had not had time to learn to fly well enough to survive their first engagement, let alone to win it. The Americans they were now facing had the aircraft, had the training, had the numbers, and increasingly had the experience. Tsunoda flew combat until 1944. He survived the war. He died in 2013 at the age of 95, one of the last men alive who had flown at Pearl Harbor. This is the forensic center of the story. Yamamoto's warning to Tokyo was not a single dramatic statement. It was a consistent, documented, multi-year argument made through official channels, private correspondence, and direct conversations with Navy ministry officials. The famous phrase about awakening a sleeping giant, whatever its precise wording, was not a moment of poetic regret after a battle. It was the summary of a strategic position he had held and articulated for years before the attack. The attack happened not because Yamamoto believed it would work in the long run, but because he lost the internal argument and decided that if the war was coming regardless, he would at least try to win it as quickly as possible. He was, in a precise sense, right about everything that mattered and unable to stop any of it. If this investigation is showing you the gap between what the historical record actually contains and what the popular version of this story usually conveys, not the myth of the reluctant admiral who had a single prescient moment, but the portrait of a man who spent years trying to stop a war he knew his country would lose, and then spent 2 more years fighting it with everything he had, press the like button. It keeps this kind of forensic work visible. And it matters that it stays visible. Part 4. The Verdict. That is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Yamamoto's warning was not a prophecy, it was an analysis. The distinction matters enormously because prophecy implies mystery and analysis implies method. And what Yamamoto was doing was method. He had data. He had first-hand observation. He had spent 7 years in the United States across 2 separate postings. He had read the production statistics. He had driven through the oil fields and the steel towns. He had watched the congressional debates. And he had done what professional military officers are supposed to do with data. He had drawn the most honest conclusion the data supported, regardless of whether that conclusion was politically acceptable. The conclusion was that Japan's industrial base was insufficient to sustain a long war against the United States. The specific numbers, in retrospect, vindicate his analysis, with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. Japan entered the war with a combined fleet of 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, 36 cruisers, and 113 destroyers. By the end of the war, in August of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost all 10 battleships, all of its fleet carriers, 28 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. The United States Navy in the same period had grown from roughly 346 principal combatants to over 1,000. The United States commissioned 28 fleet and light carriers during the war. Japan commissioned 17, and most of those were smaller vessels, converted from other hull types. The aircraft numbers are the final proof of Yamamoto's arithmetic. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, the United States produced 324,750 military aircraft of all types. Japan produced 70,457. The ratio over the full war, 4.6 to 1. And the pilot numbers are the most damning of all. Japan began the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. It lost the core of that force, the experienced 800-hour veterans, in the battles of 1942 and 1943. By the summer of 1944, the quality gap had become so severe that the Navy was developing a formal program to use aircraft as guided missiles with pilots inside them, accepting the death of the pilot as the price of achieving any meaningful hit probability at all. The program was called kamikaze. It was not fanaticism, it was arithmetic. When you cannot train pilots fast enough to survive long enough to deliver bombs accurately, you convert the pilot into the guidance system and accept the loss. Yamamoto never saw this outcome. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville Island in the Solomon Islands. American Signals Intelligence, the Ultra program that had broken Japanese naval codes, had intercepted his flight itinerary. 16 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flew a 550-mile intercept mission timed to the minute. His transport was shot down over the jungle. He was 58 years old. The decision to kill him was made at the highest levels of the American government. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox approved the mission. The question of whether to kill Yamamoto, whether his death would cause Japanese command to suspect that their codes were broken, and whether that risk was worth eliminating their most capable naval commander, was debated for 36 hours before the order was given. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved it. President Roosevelt was informed. The man who shot down Yamamoto's aircraft was First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, 24 years old, from Culver, Oregon, a former Oregon State University student who had been flying P-38s in the Pacific since early 1943. Barber was one of 18 pilots who flew the intercept mission. The credit for the kill was disputed between Barber and another pilot, Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., for decades after the war, and the dispute was never fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Barber died in 2001. The argument about who fired the final shots outlasted both men. Yamamoto was given a state funeral in Tokyo on June 5, 1943. His ashes were divided between Tama Cemetery in Tokyo and Chusoji Temple in his home city of Nagaoka. He was posthumously promoted to Fleet Admiral and awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum First Class. The Japanese public was told he had died in combat leading his men. The nature of his death, that he had been shot down based on intercepted communications, that the Americans had been reading Japanese naval codes for over a year, was not disclosed. Now consider what his death meant in the context of his own analysis. Yamamoto had said he could run wild for 6 months. He was killed 16 months after Pearl Harbor. The war lasted another 28 months after his death. The industrial production figures for those 28 months, the carriers commissioned, the aircraft built, the pilots trained, the destroyers launched, are a direct confirmation of everything he had tried to explain to Tokyo in 1940 and 1941. The factories did not sleep. The common mythology around Yamamoto reduces his insight to a single dramatic sentence about sleeping giants. The mythology is not entirely wrong, the sentence captures something real, but it misses the harder truth, which is that Yamamoto's warning was not a moment of intuition. It was the product of years of direct observation, careful analysis, and the willingness to draw an unpopular conclusion from reliable data. He was not prescient in the mystical sense. He was accurate in the professional sense. He had done the math that his superiors refused to do, and the math was correct. The tragedy, if tragedy is the right word for a conflict that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people worldwide, is not that Tokyo failed to listen to a prophet. The tragedy is that they failed to engage with an analysis. The data was available. The production statistics were not secret. The size of the American economy was not hidden. Japan's own intelligence services had access to the same numbers Yamamoto had seen. The failure was not informational. It was institutional. A military culture that had elevated the primacy of spirit over material, that had built its self-image on Tsushima and the Russo-Japanese War, that had constructed a doctrine around the decisive battle rather than the sustained campaign, could not process data that contradicted its foundational assumptions. This is not a uniquely Japanese failure, it is a human one. Every military institution in history has had some version of this problem, the gap between what the data says and what the institution needs to believe. The difference at Pearl Harbor is that the gap was quantifiable in advance. A man with access to the relevant information had quantified it, and that man's quantification was correct in every material particular. Yamamoto had seen the factories, he had driven through Pennsylvania, he had watched the oil fields of Texas, he had sat in the congressional galleries and listened to the appropriations debates. He had done what intelligence officers and strategic planners are supposed to do, which is to look at the world as it actually is, rather than as doctrine requires it to be. And then he climbed into a Mitsubishi G4M transport aircraft on the morning of April 18, 1943, wearing his dress whites, following a flight itinerary that had been transmitted in a code the enemy had been reading for 16 months. The sleeping giant he had awakened had been awake for some time by then. It had been building carriers, it had been training pilots, it had been rolling aircraft off assembly lines at a rate that no Japanese planner had been willing to commit to paper, because committing it to paper would have required acknowledging that the war was already decided. He had said he could run wild for 6 months. He had been right about that too. 6 months, and then the factories. If this forensic investigation gave you something that the standard account of Pearl Harbor usually leaves out, not the attack itself, but the man who planned it and why he was already grieving before the bombs fell, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. These stories don't survive by accident. They survive because someone decides they're worth keeping visible. Yamamoto had done the math. The math was right. And the saddest part of this entire history is not that he lost. It is that he knew he would lose before he began, said so clearly, on record, in writing, and planned the attack anyway, because the alternative was to stand aside and watch someone less careful make an even worse mistake. He had seen the factories. That was enough to know.